Good morning and welcome, and thank you for joining us to today's conversation with Dr. Peniel Joseph about race and democracy. The Jewish Community Relations Council is a public affairs organization working on behalf of the Bay Area Jewish community. We represent synagogues and Jewish organizations on critical issues affecting Jews as individuals and as a group. We build bridges with other faith, ethnic, and emerging groups that share our passion for social justice, forging relationships based on the issues our community cares about most. Today's program is part of JCRC's Democracy Initiative. We believe that the Jewish community has a special need to fight for a strong, healthy, democratic, and civil society. History has taught us, and today's heightened racism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism are once again proving that the safety of the Jewish people and of all marginalized groups depends on robust democratic institutions and freedoms and strong relationships between our religious, ethnic, and racial neighbors. The first half of 2020 has seen massive changes on a global scale. Around the world, the coronavirus pandemic has devastated the lives and livelihoods of millions while threatening economies and leaving in its wake uncertainty, insecurity, and fear. Issues of economic justice are suddenly and urgently at the forefront. The pandemic and resulting economic crisis have bluntly revealed the disparities that exist in this country for people of color and those less well off, who are suffering disproportionate rates of illness and death, job loss in greater numbers, and more challenges with basic needs such as housing, food, healthcare, and their children's education, amid a wealth gap that only continues to grow. The murder by police of George Floyd in May laid bare for all to see the racial injustice, discrimination, and inequality that Black Americans have endured for centuries. Huge protests have vented outrage and pain while uniting much of the country around the importance of Black lives through the Black Lives Matter movement. It is within this context that we have the honor to hear from Dr. Peniel Joseph, founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at the University of Texas at Austin. But before we begin, a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded and may be shown again or shared by JCRC. We will have about 15 minutes for Q&A after our discussion with Dr. Joseph. If you have a question at any time, please feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and write in your question. Jessica Trubowitch will be reading them aloud during the Q&A. I now turn things over to my colleague, Jessica, to introduce Dr. Joseph and facilitate the rest of the program.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Let me start with the introduction. In fall 2015, Dr. Peniel E. Joseph joined the University of Texas at Austin as founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. He received a joint professorship appointment to the LBJ School of Public Affairs as the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values and at the History Department in the College of Liberal Arts. Prior to joining the UT faculty, Dr. Joseph was a professor at Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts, where he also founded the school's Center for the Study of Race and Democracy to promote engaged research and scholarship focused on the ways issues of race and democracy impact the lives of global citizens. He received a BA from SUNY at Stony Brook and a PhD from Temple University. Dr. Joseph's career focus has been on what he describes as Black Power studies, which encompasses interdisciplinary fields such as Africana studies, law and society, women's and ethnic studies, and political science. He is a frequent national commentator on issues of race, democracy, and civil rights, and has authored award-winning books, Waiting Till the Midnight Hour, A Narrative History of Black Power in America, and Dark Days, Bright Nights, From Black Power to Barack Obama. Dr. Joseph's most recent book, The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, examines the political lives of two social movement leaders who assumed divergent but crucially similar roles. Stokely, A Life, has been called the definitive biography of Stokely Carmichael, the man who popularized the phrase Black Power and led the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee known as the SNCC. The recipient of fellowships from Harvard University's Charles Warren Center, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and the Ford Foundation. His essays have appeared in the Journal of American History, the Chronicle Review, the New York Times, the Black Scholar, Souls, and American Historical Review. Dr. Joseph is a frequent contributor to Newsweek, The Root, and Reuters, and his articles, op-eds, and books reviews have been published in newspapers from the Washington Post to the New York Times. Dr. Joseph's commentary has also been featured on National Public Radio, The Colbert Report, PBS, and MSNBC. It is a pleasure and an honor to speak with you today, Dr. Joseph, and we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us.
Thank you for having me, Jessica. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. So I wanted to start out today just by asking you to tell us about your work at the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. What goes on there? What is your center about?
Yeah, we're an anti-racist research center, and basically we do anti-racist research. I think somebody should go on mute because I could definitely hear, yeah, okay, something in the background. And I have little ones too, so I know it's kids and stuff. Mine are upstairs, so this is the new normal. So what we do at the center, and it's so interesting what's happened the last just 4 months since George Floyd's tragic murder, is people want to be in this space of anti-racism. And we've been in that space looking at pedagogy, social policy research, funding student fellows who go out and do work with nonprofits, some who do work in the corporate space, doing research around voting rights, doing research around race and vulnerability when it comes to everything from domestic violence to the criminal justice system, to unemployment, to lack of access, you're in the Bay Area, to VC and private equity and hedge fund. So really, because that's the game. One of the biggest things is even as we're very interested in social movements, social activism, but we're also interested in race and wealth inequality and race and wealth building. So, and not just VC, venture capital, we're interested in venture philanthropy and how come there are so few Black people on nonprofit boards and for-profit boards. So one of the things we're seeing in the work we do is to say, why has, when we think about the United States, even after the civil rights movement, why do we have this embedded racial caste system in the United States? And a racial caste system is just a hierarchy, it's just a ladder when I teach it, white at the top, Black at the bottom. And the races in between, when you think about Latinx, Native American, Indigenous, Asian folks, they're all scrambling to be closer to whiteness than Blackness, because whiteness provides you a context to have access to a supply chain of power and privilege in the United States, and Blackness gives you access to a supply chain of grief and misery. So who would want to be in racially segregated, economically impoverished neighborhoods if they had a choice to be in, yes, racially segregated, but economically thriving neighborhoods and public schools? So when we think about where we're at today, anti-Black racism is the organizing principle of our democracy. And I think the George Floyd murder really cast that in sharp relief. And for really the first time in American history, we had about 20 million people go out in the streets. We had really large numbers of white people. Sometimes people are calling them white allies. Sometimes they're calling it allyship. I probably use a term like solidarity, who are really just out in the streets saying Black Lives Matter and talking about Black citizenship and dignity. And when it comes to the Jewish community, we have a long history, a long positive history when you think about Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and how he stood shoulder to shoulder with Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. King in Selma and elsewhere, of having real strong allyship around resistance to anti-Semitism and resistance to anti-Black racism, right? And in the last couple of decades, there's aspects of that have deteriorated because of disagreements, political disagreements over the Middle East and other things. But we shouldn't forget the common denominator, because the common denominator is that there have always been huge allies in the Jewish community who really did go down to Mississippi. You think about Mississippi Freedom Summer in 1964, a lot of the folks who came down to Mississippi Freedom Summer were Jewish. And Mississippi Freedom Summer is, you know, you called it, Jessica, the SNCC. It's really SNCC. That's what they call themselves. So they didn't call themselves SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And I'll share what that was. So SNCC is the most important grassroots civil rights organization of the 20th century, you know? And I say grassroots, so I don't want to besmirch the NAACP, but what SNCC did is bring a group of interracial volunteers, mostly students, who went to places like Arkansas and Southwest Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and they tried to bring small d democracy to those places at risk of the threat of their lives, at the risk of their lives, right? So when we think about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, we would not have had voting rights. We would not have had desegregation. When you think about the Civil Rights Act, it starts with the lunch counter sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina. But SNCC is very, very important. And there's going to be some really good Jewish allyship within SNCC in the 1960s. That's very, very important for us to think about as a marker for as we move forward into the future.
Thank you for that, and I hope we can talk more about solidarity and allyship later on. But I want to stick a little bit with your background in the center, because I know this is the second center that you started. Yes. So I wonder what really inspires you and moved you to stay with this sort of organization and to kind of bring it to these different places.
Yeah, you know, my work, Jessica, is on the Black freedom struggle. And I grew up in New York City, so to give you a bit of my background, and I'm the proud son of Haitian immigrants. My mother, who's 81 years young in New York City still, was a hospital worker, Mount Sinai Hospital, largely a Jewish hospital. We grew up around a lot of Jewish Americans who were part of 1199 SEIU. And so I was on my first picket line in elementary school in the 1980s during Reagan's America. And my mother is a social justice activist, a human rights activist, a feminist. So those are things that got me interested in civil rights and racial justice. So I was deeply interested in Haitian history. I was deeply interested in American history, the history of the American presidents. I was deeply interested in the history of civil rights. And then I found out about Black political activists and radicals, people like Angela Davis, people like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker. And as I went forward in my career and wrote more books, one of the things that I saw was that so much of racial justice movements were really connected to trying to grapple with and expand and reimagine democracy. And in this way that, you know, when we think about democracy, and obviously we're in very, very critical times with this critical election coming up, we think about it in a partisan way, but we shouldn't. Democracy is a concept and an idea, goes back to ancient Greece, this idea of the demos and this idea of representative people who are going to be ruled by themselves. It's really self-rule, right? And when we think about American democracy, it's always evolving, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. And that's one of the things that we don't want to admit. For instance, women did not have the right to vote. And it's really not just until 1920. All women didn't have the right to vote until 1965. And there's been some great work. New York Times editorial board wrote a great piece this past Sunday highlighting the role of Black women in the suffrage movement. And there's a great new book by Martha Jones called Vanguard that looks at Black women's role that's just about to come out. And people can pre-order. She's a fellow Basic Books author with me. And it's called Vanguard. And when we think about something like the right for all women to vote, it shows you that democracy doesn't just proceed in a linear fashion. So that's what I was so interested in terms of race and democracy, because I think the origin story of the United States is the way in which race has shaped our ideas about freedom and citizenship and democracy, about wealth, about community, about neighborhoods, about healthcare, about punishment and systems of punishment versus systems of second chances and systems that allow us to flourish as human beings, right? It shapes religion, whether you're Christian or Jewish. It shapes the secular aspects of our society, right? So that's why I was so interested in race and democracy, and I continue to be, interested. It's a passion project for me, and I think that 2020 has exposed to the world and many Americans and many white Americans, and I think it's renewed and reinvigorated Jewish Americans who want to be in this space, and who at a time, like I said, there's a heyday where Jewish Americans and Black Americans who are right in this space together. That predates the 60s too. If you think about the 1930s, you think about City University of New York, which allows, it's open to Jews, but not, because Columbia wasn't open to Jews because of anti-Semitism. And at times there's gonna be Jewish students at City College who are, anti-racist. They're part of trying to help Black people break down those barriers too. Jews who are part of the Communist Party or just left-wing socialists, Marxists, were also anti-racist in a lot of ways. So there's this heyday, and like I said, then we sort of drift. we drift. And if anything, I think that 2020 might be the time that we say is a demarcating line, when you saw much more a return in a new way to the solidarity and the political coalitions between Blacks and Jews in service of civil and human rights.
Well, I definitely hope that's the case, and I think it's the case as well. And so I hope we travel that way together. So I saw you in an interview on C-SPAN when you talked about this time as a watershed moment in history. And you also said it's a moment that we could possibly restructure our democracy to be more multiracial, or a multiracial democracy. So can you share with us why you think it's a watershed moment and what you meant by a multi-ethnic democracy?
Yeah, no, certainly. And I'll talk about Dr. King's beloved community. The go-to that I always give is the Black Lives Matter movement has a 10-point program, which is great. And I want to talk about some of those 10 points. This is a watershed moment. We do have a generational opportunity to defeat white supremacy, to end systemic racism, to do what James Baldwin described as achieving our country. But what Martin Luther King Jr., who's one of the people I've studied for decades now, one of my heroes, when he talked about the beloved community, he also talked about shared sacrifice. And that means Black, white, but it also means Jews, Christians, Muslims, secular. And by shared sacrifice, I mean, we have to give up aspects of our privilege. Like one of the things I think we're all having a better understanding is that when we think about things like lily white suburbs versus chocolate inner cities, right? Or even chocolate suburbs, right? They are linked, they are connected. The reason why you have the suburbs that have great testing scores and nice manicured lawns, and only single family homes can be built there. Richard Rothstein has the great book, The Color of Law, right? Which looks at the way in which anti-Black racism has configured housing discrimination, has configured tax policy and zoning policy, financial policies, at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level. So the reason why you have sky-rise projects versus Levitt towns for whites, it's connected to racial discrimination and racism during the New Deal, during the Second World War, and the creation of the Federal Housing Authority and 30-year low-interest mortgages for whites, that at times Jews were able to have access to, even though there was robust anti-Semitism. One of the things we're seeing post-Nuremberg is that Jewish Americans, especially those who aren't going to be what people might say is very overtly religious. Certainly some Jews anglicize their names, right? But even as early as 1947, we have Gregory Peck in the great film, A Gentleman's Agreement, who's a WASP, who goes undercover as a Jew to show all the discrimination that happens. I would urge, I'm a cinephile, so I'll talk about things like Gregory Peck in 1947, A Gentleman's Agreement, which is a very, very good pro-Jewish, anti-Semitic film, right? And people say, wow, how do you know that? Well, I'm interested in everything. And so that's part of the Anglicization of aspects of Jewry. Not all. I lived in New York City and in Brooklyn for a time, and we had our Hasidic brothers and sisters who were very proudly and very, very, they had their own perspective and cultural traditions, deep, and they were victims of discrimination and at times physical violence in New York City. And so what you see is that in the aftermath of the Second World War, there are certain Jews who can become white. And there's even great literature on this. There's whole whiteness studies, how the Irish became white, how the Italians became white, but also how the Jews became white, right? In terms of having access to whiteness in a way that Black people never have had. And so when we think about that multiracial democracy, the sacrifice means that we're gonna all have to think about, why are people talking about things like reparations and defund the police and prison abolition, the end of cash bail, publicly financed campaigns, the end of ICE and treating immigrants as decent human beings, certainly robust mechanisms to end anti-Semitism when we think about massacres in Pittsburgh mosques and other things happening globally, right? So that is all connected, and that Jewish Americans see Black folks and the idea of free healthcare and free schools and transforming the military budget as something that is intimately connected to their struggle for dignity and citizenship as well, right? And so one of the things I would say is that the Black Lives Matter movement has been very, very important, BLM 2.0, because it follows in the tradition of the civil rights and Black Power movements. Civil rights talked about at times radical reforms. Black Power activists talked about structural revolutionary reforms. And the reason why I talk about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm talked about radical Black dignity, King talked about radical Black citizenship. What Malcolm means is eliminating and eradicating white supremacy in a way that allows Black people to organize political self-determination for themselves, both in the United States and Africa. And in a way that's similar to what Jewish Americans advocated when you think about the creating of the state of Israel. Absolutely, that there was going to be a symmetrical relationship, that one would help the other. And Malcolm argued that in terms of Africa and the Organization of African Unity, which he goes to Cairo, Egypt in 1964, and he also creates his own Organization of Afro-American Unity. King is arguing for radical Black citizenship, and what King means by that is not just an end of Jim Crow segregation and racism and police brutality. He means more than voting rights. He talks about a universal basic income. Dr. King talks about health care for all. He talks about decent housing for all people and guaranteed employment and food justice, because one of the plans for the Poor People's Campaign, which is multiracial, is to protest at the Department of Agriculture and protest at these different federal agencies that are really marginalizing and oppressing people, Black people in the United States. That being said, both of them understood that the common denominator was really racial oppression, like race, class, gender, sexuality. They're all connected, but it's lived through most cogently through race. The anti-Black racism is the organizing principle in this society. So when King is in Marks, Mississippi in 1968, he starts to speak in the language of Malcolm X. Malcolm X had historically said that the way in which Black people have been treated in the United States was a crime, that there was a series of crimes that had happened to them dating back to racial slavery. So before the 1619 Project, which is a great New York Times Pulitzer Prize winning multimedia project by my friend Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's won the Pulitzer Prize, and really our towering journalist. You know, she's the Ida B. Wells of this century, and Ida B. Wells was just given a posthumous Pulitzer Prize, and she's the anti-lynching crusader, a mentee of Frederick Douglass, a colleague of W.B. Du Bois, and we don't know more about Ida B. Wells in our own time, because of the deep patriarchy and hatred of women and very special hatred of Black women, right? So we should know about Ida B. Wells and Susan B. Anthony, just the way in which you know about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. You know what I mean? Like everyone should know that. Every little school boy should know who they are, and not just the girls, but the boys, because it will change our conception of who we are, right? And so when we think about King, he starts to say that the way in which poor Black people in Marks, Mississippi, poorest zip code in the United States, Jessica, he meets up with them. And this is a great anecdote. So King meets up with them in around February of 1968, a couple of months before his assassination. And he meets up with poor Black folks in Marks, Mississippi. And he meets up with hundreds of them, and their kids are so poor, they're not wearing any shoes. They talk about having no blankets when it's cold. No food. And this is the middle of the Great Society. King is in tears. Andy Young is there, Ralph Abernathy, and they just can't believe him. He's just crying, talking to them. And he tells them, and we have the video, him telling him this, we've got the film. He says that the way in which they're being treated in Marks, Mississippi is a crime. And they're gonna go and occupy Washington until there's a remedy to this crime. So he starts speaking the language of Malcolm X. But what's extraordinary about King is that in that same meeting, he tells them that white European settlers were given millions of acres of free land via the Homestead Act. And Black people, even after racial slavery, the whole promise of 40 acres and a mule was reneged on, right? So there was no way to make, and he says, these are the same people telling you today to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. And he keeps telling that story, and he actually goes to a rabbinical conference in the Catskills shortly after, and he tells that story there as well, right? And so it's in the Catskills, New York. So it's very, very interesting in terms of when we think about King, we never look at the radical and the revolutionary King. And that's where I love Rabbi Heschel, because he's a prophetic figure as well as King. So King, on April 4th, 1967, says the United States at the Riverside Church in New York is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, right? And King says that the United States is a society that's sick with the cancer of racism, but he's being criticized, but he's only a doctor who is diagnosing the illness, and he's not the cause. So the cause of racism isn't Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., just like the cause of anti-Semitism isn't Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. They are diagnosing the problem. But people push back. People push back because they understand that for them, the cost will be too much to provide human dignity for these groups and to provide actual citizenship. So one of the things I think we have to think about now, and you know, the 10 points, reparations, and we could talk about what does that mean. No bail. The cash bail system comes out of the convict lease system and white supremacy right after the Civil War. And remember, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments end racial slavery, except in terms of punishment, like Ava DuVernay's fantastic documentary, The 13th, reveals to everybody. The 14th Amendment is birthright citizenship, which certain conservatives and racists are trying to get rid of now. And the 15th is really Black male suffrage. We wanted women to get it, but the Congress would only allow men to get it. So that's what happens with Black male suffrage. But as soon as those amendments are passed in 1865, 1868, 1870, what you find is convict lease systems. You find, and these are the incarceration of free Black women and men for so-called vagrancy crimes. What right now New York City and other people call quality of life crimes. And that's why the whole crackdown on crime is always linked to white supremacy, because instead of investing in communities, what you do is incarcerate people and you super exploit the Black bodies that were exploited during racial slavery in another way. You connect them to a supply chain of mostly federal and of mostly state and federal and local prisons, but a 10% thriving private prison industry. But also you connect them to, 1 million people were employed just because of a prison industrial complex. And there's about 4.5 other million people who are on probation or parole, and they're surveilled that way. And there's a whole supply chain of costs. People are taxed in terms of fines, fees, warrants, phone calls. When people are under surveillance, like they have things that are put on their ankles, ankle monitoring. It's the inmates and their families that pay for that. This is all going back to Reconstruction and slavery and the resumption of white supremacy even during Reconstruction. And Reconstruction, for everyone, is 1865 to 1877. Redemption, the notion of the Redeemer South, is 1877 to 1896. And so when we think about the Klan and we think about the lynching that Brian Stevenson has documented in the lynching memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, that is just the tip of the iceberg. The 6,500 or so people who were lynched. There's tens of thousands who are going to be killed, both in Black towns, all Black towns, and those who are in predominantly white areas as well during this period. So it's not just Tulsa and Rosewood. It's going to be massacres in Mississippi and South Carolina and Texas and other places during this period. So it's important for us to understand that much of this never stops. Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns is very interesting, and it's a great book that looks at the Great Migration. And she has got the new book, Caste, that looks at the idea of a racial caste system. But the things that I want to talk about, just, and then we can continue, but reparations, no bail, the movement for Black Lives, release all prostitutes from jail. So many people who are considered sex workers, especially those underage, who are being trafficked by gangs, by organized crime. So many of them are disproportionately people of color. So many of them are disproportionately Black. Black trans women have this massive murder rate where no one's investigating the murder of Black trans women. And you saw a big, massive Black Trans Lives rally in Brooklyn this June, where tens of thousands of people are there. So if people want to talk about solidarity, you've got to bring that up all the time. No death penalty. The death penalty is racist, folks. You know, I agree with Mike Dukakis, and I don't agree with a lot on Mike Dukakis. But in '88, when Mike Dukakis said no to the death penalty, I agree. And as a human rights activist, that's a courageous stance. All of us who think of ourselves as humanists, whether it's religious humanists, I'm a Baptist, I'm a Christian, I think of myself as a Christian humanist, or a secular humanist, I think of myself as that too. We shouldn't agree with the death penalty. Free education, yes, free education. Education is a tool for advancement. I went to a state school. I wouldn't be here without it. Education is a real tool. My first fall semester of tuition was $495, $495. And then they bumped it to $1,300 the next semester, and we protested the bump. SUNY Stony Brook University. Free healthcare, it's obvious that everybody should have access to Medicare for all. That's just really a no-brainer, and Black Lives Matter has talked about that, advocated. Defund the police means reimagining public safety. It's not somehow anti-cop and anti-security. It's saying that what we've done, especially since Dr. King's assassination on Thursday, April 4th at 6 p.m. Memphis time, 1968, we had an opportunity there to pick the beloved community, and we doubled down on law and order in a bipartisan way. So one thing I have to stress is that when we think about presidents in the United States, Nixon, Carter, Reagan, the Bushes, Clinton, they all, when it comes to Black lives and the criminal justice system, the welfare system, they all supported policies that I would argue, and I think Dr. King would argue, were morally reprehensible. They all supported policies that ratcheted up criminal injustice, that ratcheted up the premature death of Black women and children and boys and girls. They all supported policies that further amplified racial segregation in public schools and neighborhoods. And they all supported policies that really helped amplify wealth inequality in the United States. We have the biggest wealth inequality since the Gilded Age, the age of the Astors and the Rockefellers and the Mellons and the Vanderbilts, which is really an age of kleptocracy and oligarchy, right? Those were plunderers. And that's why Teddy Roosevelt was known as the trust buster, right? And then Franklin Delano Roosevelt introduces social democracy here when we think about Social Security and the Wagner Act. Reduce the military budget right now from the general revenues. We're spending 53 cents per dollar on the military. We have 47 cents for everything else. That's hugely problematic. Doesn't mean you have no military, it means you have a smaller imprint. We have so many nuclear arms and so many ways to destroy the world multiple times over. You actually don't need the 800 or 900 bases that we have around the world. These are just facts. It's just that the military, like the police and law enforcement in the United States, has become its own industrial complex and its lobby. So of course, I'm a professor. Do I think we need more professors? Yes, because I'm a professor. You know, so do I think having more PhDs is a good thing? I say, yeah, I think that's very good. And so if somebody says, hey, let's get 100,000 new more PhDs and we'll have employment for them, do I think that's a good thing? Yes, I'll say it's a good thing. But if the society then a few years later or a generation later says, hey, maybe we have too many PhDs in history, I'm going to say, if there's less PhDs, civilization's going to end. That's what I'm going to say. That's the argument. And that's what they're doing as well. So we have to understand that that's just a very, very specific lobby. But those investments preclude us from doing other investments, but primarily in terms of not just people of color, but Black communities. Redistribution of wealth. We have redistribution of wealth right now. We have the opposite of progressive taxes. Even the latest tax policy that Congress passed really, it provides more resources for the top wealth earners through tax cuts at the expense of those who are middle income, who are students, and who are impoverished. This happened with the Reagan tax cuts as well. So we do actually need a redistribution of wealth. Part of that is with a progressive tax policy that includes a wealth tax on people who are very wealthy, and that includes corporations paying their fair share. And then finally, publicly financed campaigns. We should not have super PACs. The idea of every single citizen having a max of $2,500 to give and no way around that makes sense to me. Just because you're a billionaire, us restricting you to $2,500 is not a restriction of speech. And everybody understands that that's nonsensical to even say, right? And there's other reforms. I mean, the Supreme Court, we should have a Supreme Court that is not just ideological, you know. People have talked about term limits for the Supreme Court. It has become an unelected branch of super legislators. And whether you want liberals or conservatives in there, that's not who you should want. You should actually want somebody who is going to be open-minded about the law and hasn't passed a bunch of litmus tests, irrespective of what those ideological litmus tests actually are. You know, so there's many different things, but those are some big ones.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. That was really rich, and you covered so many of the topics that I wanted to cover, and also I see so much common ground and commonality in our JCRC's policy advocacy and what you just shared with us. So I can't decide, but I think I'm going to stick with just your book for a minute, because I want to ask you a question or two about your book, and then move into some like stuff about today and policy advocacy today. So in your introduction of your book, you write that Martin and Malcolm both recognize the pivotal role of violence played in maintaining America's racial caste system, a system that defined white violence against Black bodies as legitimate, legal, and morally just, and that regarded Black violence, even in defense of Black humanity, as criminal, dangerous, and a threat to law and order. So I wonder if Martin and Malcolm were sitting up above us, watching us today, what do you think they'd be thinking about the murder of George Floyd? And what do you think they'd be thinking about the uprisings that sprang up after his murder.
Yeah, that's great. Jessica, can you mute your thank you.
Yes.
You know, I think that Malcolm would say, "I told you so." You know, I told you so, because Malcolm, I think it's always important. I think with the sword and the shield, the basic argument is that the way we frame Martin and Malcolm is wrong. We frame them as polar opposites, and we have to frame them as the alter ego of each other. That even as Dr. King never wants to use violence, and Malcolm always retains the right of self-defense, they come to see that you need dignity and citizenship in service of this larger human rights movement. But Malcolm was always very skeptical about American democracy because his father had been murdered by white supremacists in Lansing, Michigan when he was 6. So Malcolm is a Black child of racial trauma of the 1930s and 40s. Malcolm's mother is placed in a psychiatric facility for most of his adult life. He's a foster child. He becomes involved in criminal activities at an early age in Roxbury and Harlem, New York, Roxbury, Boston, and Harlem, New York. It's petty crime, it's selling weed, it's theft, but he ends up serving 76 months in 3 different prisons. And what's interesting about Malcolm is that it's one of those prisons, Norfolk, which is an experimental prison in Massachusetts, that basically gives him a college education and a postgraduate education. He had left school at the end of the 8th grade. He had always been precocious. He told a white teacher he wanted to be a lawyer, and they said he could only be a carpenter because he was Black. He went to a school where the racism was so thick that even as he was voted class president, this predominantly white school in Mason, Michigan, in junior high, they routinely referred to him with racial slurs, both teachers and students. And Malcolm has a great anecdote, so does Dr. King, of watching Gone with the Wind in 1939. Like, Malcolm actually sees it at the movies. And I think people here will remember Gone with the Wind. I've seen it multiple times growing up in New York City. And Gone with the Wind is an extremely racist and dehumanizing depiction of antebellum slavery that sets up white supremacists and those who betrayed America as heroes. So Vivian Lee's Scarlett O'Hara and Clark Gable's Rhett Butler, these are morally reprehensible people, but they're presented as heroes. And at one point, Scarlett O'Hara slaps Butterfly McQueen in the face. And Butterfly McQueen plays the enslaved African servant girl, a young lady named Prissy. And Hattie McDaniel wins an Oscar for playing basically Scarlett O'Hara's mammy figure. And Malcolm says that when Butterfly McQueen got into her act, he felt like crawling under the rug, because Butterfly McQueen, Prissy, is engaged in just a minstrel show. She's loud, she's fearful, she's unintelligent. These are all grotesque mischaracterizations and caricatures of Blackness that come directly out of white supremacy and not just the nostalgia, but the victory of the Confederacy after the Civil War. And so when you think about Gone with the Wind, just like the Confederate flag and the monuments that have been toppling over the last 5 months, these were really not just symbols. Just like Stone Mountain in Georgia is not just a symbol. These are substantive declarations of war against Black life and against Black dignity and citizenship. And that's why we say Black Lives Matter, because everything around us shows that it actually does not, right? And so Gone with the Wind is very interesting how Dr. King also remembers Gone with the Wind. He's 10 when it premieres in Atlanta, and he's living in Atlanta. And his father, Daddy King, Martin Luther King Sr., who's very erudite, educated man, is telling him how this is bad news and these are racist and stuff. And King, the 10-year-old King, is appalled that there's this big premiere in Atlanta and there's all these. And remember, Gone with the Wind is the #1 film of the era, right? And that's who we are. And I think it's important for us to understand that, because the only way to get out of the bind that we're in is by acknowledging and recognizing the depths that we have fallen to and that we continue to fall. Like we see what's happening in our own country, assaults on democracy, the post office is being pilloried and abused right now, right before election. This is all for people who have believed in the myth of American exceptionalism. This is science fiction stuff. This is Orwellian. This is like an episode of the Twilight Zone that refuses to stop, including plague and murder and violence. Now, King believed in reform until he didn't. So the last 3 years, King really joins, you talk about Rabbi Heschel, these are modern day prophets. I think Malcolm X as a Muslim is also a modern day prophet. So I'll put Malcolm and Rabbi Heschel and King, and there's people like Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, there's a lot of these prophets, these prophetic figures who are Jewish, who are Gentiles, who are Muslim, who are Black, white, everything. And so I think King, by the end of his life, and if he was here now, they would get together in saying that something is profoundly wrong, but we can actually organize a massive movement of the dispossessed to transform these structures. And King tried to do that nonviolently, peacefully. I think Malcolm always hedged. I think he always said that the state is who dictated whether people were going to be violent or not. And I think a great lesson for all of America, and if we remember 1968 in Grant Park, which is different from 2008 Grant Park. So 1968 Grant Park is where Chicago and Mayor Daley sent out the Chicago PD on a mission just to bust heads against white and Black demonstrators. But when you notice the footage is demonstrators being beaten, and their slogan is "the whole world is watching." That's what they're chanting outside the Democratic National Convention. And here's what they meant. They meant that there was a huge chasm between the rhetoric of American democracy and the reality of American democracy, right? And Vietnam had been one of the things that exposed it, but anti-Black racism, civil rights exposed it too. And so when we think about where we're at now, the difference between the rhetoric of American democracy and its reality, it's even starker now. So what's happened this spring, when you saw cops in Buffalo, New York, crack the skull of this older white man, this elderly white man, you saw what you're dealing with. And you continue to see that. We've seen white supremacists murder innocent bystanders and people who are marching. We've seen cops kill people, not just George Floyd, but No Knock, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. We've seen rubber bullets, Austin, my new hometown, leaving a young man in a coma. We've had at least 9 people lose eyes during demonstrations. So we're in trouble. we're in trouble. We have a lot of work to do, because that is not a civilized society. But what we did since 1968, the reason why we have 800,000 police officers and 18,000 police departments is exactly because we betrayed Martin Luther King Jr.'s America and his vision of a beloved community. And we doubled down on this idea of law and order, and this idea that political repression that was organized by racial animus, anti-Black racial animus, was going to save us all, right? And that's why you have segregated suburbs and segregated cities and communities, segregated public schools. And part of allyship, Jessica, is that Jewish Americans are among, some of the most thoughtful, insightful, creative, intelligent, deeply empathetic people. And if Jewish Americans don't lock arm in arm wherever they might be and say that Black Lives Matter, whether they are at just local people, regular citizens, or folks who are part of organizations like yourself, or folks in Silicon Valley, people who are connected to C-suites, we're gonna be in even deeper trouble, because there's a way where our voices can absolutely be amplified in this historical moment with Black Jewish allyship that's really talking about human rights, that's asking hard questions about all of us. That's what I'm saying. So you can have an alliance and not agree on everything, right? But we need those voices more than ever.
Since we're coming down to the end of our hour, and I want to at least get one Q&A question in from the audience, I do want to ask you to speak on 3 things that I was hoping we could touch on. First of all, centering anti-racism and Black people in our work, in our racial justice work, and in our work to reform our democracy. Second, reparations. JCRC has recently supported 2 bills that call for the study of reparations. So what are your thoughts? And finally, voter suppression. I mean, is the worst that we're seeing the post office issues, or are there other places that we should be looking and focusing on that there's voter suppression happening that we need to know about?
Yeah, I'll start with voter suppression, Jessica. When we think about voter suppression, it's really, really bad since the Shelby v. Holder decision. So basically, we need a new voting rights bill. So many places, Georgia, Texas, where I live, have closed polling stations. They've purged people from the rolls. They've institutionalized voter ID. But they've also set up, they've made it very hard to vote. For instance, students in Texas have a very hard time voting because your Texas driver's license has to have your up-to-date address. And when you're a student, you move many times. You might move twice in a semester just to a different dorm. So yes, I mean, people have to, I think what we're faced with this fall is trying to organize people to vote, trying to make sure that those of us who organize people to vote in our local municipalities, we receive training on how to do that so that we're not giving people any kind of wrong advice. Because there's going to be, this current administration has organized 50,000 people around the country at least who are going to be at polls to try to discourage and intimidate and challenge people's right to vote. So voter suppression is widespread, and basically we need a John Lewis Voting Rights Act that covers all 50 states and the territories. That's what we need. When it comes to anti-racism and how do we center that, I think it's going to be both difficult and it's simple. I mean, I think on some levels you look at your organization and you want to make sure that you have Black voices within the organization and at the C-suite level and within your nonprofit boards and your for-profit boards. So you want to amplify Black voices. You want to listen. You want to listen and see if this hasn't been central to your organization's mission, why not? One of the things and one of the reasons, you asked me earlier, Jessica, why was I always interested in race and democracy? I teach at a policy school and in a history department, and I was always making the case my whole life that if you were thinking about the environment, if you were thinking about international aid, if you were thinking about food justice, if you were thinking about water policy, if you're thinking about women's rights, if you think about domestic violence, if you're thinking about the rights of reproduction for women, if you're thinking about small business access and wealth building, anything under the sun, race is at the center of it. There's just no way around it. But until this moment, many people haven't seen that. So certainly an organization like this and anybody interested in social justice at large should remember that race should be at the core of that. But then not only that, you've got to think about, okay, Blackness. Why should we think about Black people? Anti-Blackness, anti-Black racism is the organizing principle of the society. So we should be thinking about them in a number of different ways. One, there is, and this bleeds into the question about reparations, there is a moral and financial debt that's owed. I mean, the economist Sandy Darity makes the argument that in 2016 dollars, it should be $12 to $14 trillion. That becomes 800,000 per Black family that's in some kind of trust that both puts people out of debt, but it's money that they can leverage for future generations. As long as one person can prove that they are descendants of enslaved Africans. That's his formula. But I think whatever formula we need both direct payments over a 10-year period to Black families, and you also need those other things we've talked about in terms of the healthcare and the desegregation and all those things. It's really all of the above strategy. But the reason why, so there's both what is to be paid, what is to be owed, but it's also about trying to move forward too. And the only way you can solve the problem of racial and economic injustice is if you get to a point where you actually see true Black dignity and citizenship. That's going to reverberate and impact Indigenous, people of color, folks everywhere. There's not going to be a society where you have Black dignity and citizenship and there's a new group of people, a new caste. You know, Black is the lowest. It's that, and we have set it up that way. So when I say Black is the lowest, I don't mean that literally. I mean that figuratively. We've set it up that way through structures of domination and institutions, but then the thousands and millions of policy decisions that people do in their own lives, both as ordinary citizens, but in their churches, in their synagogues. Again, this is as granular as zoning policies. We have schools that are magnet schools and charter schools that are public schools that have segregation within those schools, because some of them are going to be the schools that allow people to go to the Ivy Leagues, and others are just, you know, the folks who in our minds don't deserve as many opportunities as our children. So part of this is that we opportunity hoard too. You know, we opportunity hoard. We want the best for our kids, and then our moral circle is only as small or is only as large as our family, our friends, maybe our church and synagogue, but that's it. What Dr. King asked us to, and I'll close by saying this, is that he asked us to have a moral circle that was as large as the entire universe, because from that perspective, you're going to understand that a baby that didn't look like you was as precious as your own baby, right? So when we think about what's going on, whether it's here, whether it's in the Middle East, whether anywhere around the world, we have to have empathy and appreciation for each other in the same manner that we have for our own children. I'm a father. I know how much I love my children. If you don't have that, you're able to do all kinds of evil towards other people, including children.
So I know we're down to our last minute, and I want to be respectful of your time, Dr. Joseph. But there's a number of questions that I think are, you know, important for us to acknowledge in this conversation, which is that the Jewish community is diverse. We are 20% people of color, and so we are facing our own hard conversations within our community about race, about racism. And we also want to be part of this greater movement for racial justice. So that's something to acknowledge, but also just if you have a few thoughts on that, that we could wrap up around, that's great. Otherwise, I will just kind of move us on to our next point.
Yeah, no, I think that's really true. And I think that it's both in terms of the Jewish community globally, but in the United States, it's conversations about the racial diversity within the Jewish community, but it's also conversations about ideological diversity. Some of this is connected to Israel, to Palestine, and questions of citizenship and human rights, but also it's connected to, you know, what do we mean? I think for so long, the Jewish community had historically been outsiders within the United States. They weren't outsiders in the same fashion as Black Americans, but it was close enough and at times parallel enough, especially in the context of the genocide of 6 million Jews in terms of Hitler and European fascism. You know, it's European fascism that does that. So it's not just Germany, it's also Italy. It's just, you know, it's this real, we see the cost, the carnage of anti-Semitism, and the fact that, you know, the United States didn't do enough. The United States didn't do enough to end that. You know, we should have invaded Germany in the 1930s. We knew what was happening, you know, and we didn't think that those lives mattered. We didn't. And so for a time, that parallel, those are two groups that have had this very kind of unique affliction in terms of racial slavery and Jim Crow, but then in terms of anti-Semitism and genocide. Yes, genocide. But then, as we know, as the decades ensued, African Americans, even with the civil rights victories, weren't able to get the same kind of access that Jewish Americans have received. And that has to do with racial caste, what we've talked about, because Black Americans, however hard you try, there's no way to just become an honorary white person. There's no way to pass as white. And over time, that's what's happened. And so part of it is this insider-outsider status that at times Jewish Americans have, but certainly Black Jews and Jews of color really struggle against that, including those who live in Israel. There's been some great books and scholarship on that, like how do they feel and how do they feel racism as being part of that Jewish community. So part of it becomes for Jews who are white or who can pass for white, they're faced with the double responsibility, not burden, of accessing that deep empathy, listening and finding out about these histories, and then leading with that prophetic visionary humanism of Rabbi Heschel. And you know, all of us who've read the Old Testaments and you read about Hebrew prophets, you understand what that prophetic. If you read Jeremiah, if you read Amos, you understand that these are folks who, in their own times, are not heeded, but who provide sort of this wisdom for the ages because they have deep empathy for what the Bible calls the least of these, right? And so at times when you think about not just Christian, but rabbinical traditions, when you think about the very sort of teachings of Judaism, it is about helping the least of these, but there are blind spots and everybody has blind spots. So in that case, at times within the Jewish community, people of color have not been centered and they've been disparaged and they've been victims of anti-Black racism. But then, as we know, in terms of the politics in the Middle East, what do we mean by human rights, and can we get to human rights for all people? These are huge, huge, important issues, and issues that, again, are a responsibility and not a burden, and that especially Jewish social justice advocates should be at the forefront of.
So again, I really want to thank you for your time. I wish we had more time because I feel like we could carry on this conversation for a lot longer. There's so many interesting things to talk about.
You know, Jessica, finally, for reparations, obviously the Jewish people have a history with reparations having received from Germany, rightfully so. So I think that Jewish Americans who are for social justice should obviously be supportive of reparations. I mean, I think that that's a no-brainer. And not just, one thing I'll say, Jessica, not just the study of, but reparations. And reparations, we have to understand when we say reparations is going to be an infusion into households. It's not just saying, oh, somebody gets free college tuition or something like that. Because right now, Black household wealth is 10% or less of white household wealth. And what that $12 trillion number does is bring Black household wealth to 90% of white household wealth, right? And so it's important for us to understand that when you think about reparations, it is, yes, direct infusions of resources in ways that'll make sense. There's a way that you can have a reparations package that does not cause inflation and everybody can spend the money at once, that places it in a trust so people can generationally leverage that. Somebody can't just spend it on whatever. There's a way to make it where it makes sense and it becomes this accumulative process that amplifies economic and political power and parity. And even that is not going to be enough when you have reparations and you have that wealth, because as we know, Jewish Americans sometimes get stereotyped. Not all Jewish Americans are fantastically wealthy or something, or just at the top of their class in every single field. But even those who are successful, we still have anti-Semitism. So you can have Jewish excellence and success and also anti-Semitism. So just because you had Black economic parity doesn't mean you're going to get rid of anti-Black racism. So it's important for us to understand that. But yes, Jewish Americans should absolutely, those who are for social justice at least, should be in solidarity, not just allyship, real solidarity. And by that, we mean you're standing shoulder to shoulder. When people say, well, what does solidarity mean? It means that you're not the only one in the foxhole. I'm in the foxhole with you. That's what solidarity is, right? And we're plotting and planning, well, how do we get out of there? Even if the person who hadn't been in the foxhole could have just went home and said, you could have been out of this, there's all this fire, and now you're wondering, well, how am I gonna get out of this foxhole? That's what solidarity is. So now you're feeling it. So you're not just at home telling everybody, you're telling your children and your wife and your spouse, I'm so sad that those Black folks over there in that foxhole with all that firepower, that's, they're in real trouble. You actually go down in there and you're saying, how are we going to get out of the foxhole? And that's really important. That's what solidarity means. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to close with just sharing a screen here. As people go off, you can see our email addresses if you wish to learn more about our organizations, if you wish to support our organizations. These are our websites. And please, feel free to follow up with us if you have additional questions that we couldn't get to today. So again, thank you everyone for being with us. Thank you especially to Dr. Joseph for this amazingly interesting discussion. I hope we can continue to be in touch and work together on important issues.
Oh, definitely. Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Hal.